As a trauma surgeon, Dr. Brian Williams has tended to victims of mass shootings, and he's experienced patients refusing his care because he's black. But in July of 2016, Dr. Williams treated the Dallas police officers who were shot in an ambush. 5 of those officers did not survive. And it came at a time when there was outrage over the deaths of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, 2 unarmed black men who were fatally shot by Minnesota and Baton Rouge police earlier during this time. And after losing a 5 Dallas officer, Dr. Williams addressed the nation during a very tense time, and he made the connection between race, gun violence, and respect for law enforcement. It was all on his mind. You'll hear some of that in just a moment. And now, more than 7 years later, Dr. Brian Williams is detailing his experience in a new book, The Bodies Keep Coming, Dispatches from a Black Trauma Surgeon on Racism, Violence, and How We Heal. And Dr. Williams joins me now. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, Rose. It's a tremendous honor.
Thank you. I want to go back to that day in July of 2016 and just replay a little bit of what you had to say.
I want to state first and foremost, I stand with the Dallas Police Department. I stand with law enforcement all over this country. This experience has been very personal for me and a turning point in my life. There was the added dynamic of officers being shot. We routinely care for multiple gunshot victims, but the preceding days of more black men dying at the hands of police officers affected me. I think the reasons are obvious. I fit that demographic of individuals, but I abhor what has been done to these officers, and I grieve with their families. I understand the anger and the frustration and distrust of law enforcement, but they are not the problem. The problem is the lack of open discussions about the impact of race relations in this country.
And Dr. Williams, when you listen to that, some years later now, has much changed?
Well, that day is something that's always with me. It's always kind of in the back of my mind. Mm-hmm. And hearing that press conference, I still do get a little emotional about that. It takes me back to that time. And it's just a sign that there is still a lot of work we have to do as a nation to look in the mirror and talk about how structural racism is just inherent in so many institutions, and it is still weighing us down as far as progress in this country. And listen to your previous guest who was talking about how structural racism is connected with gun violence, but there's so much more: economic inequality, housing, education, and that's what I was trying to address with this book: the broader implications of my role as a trauma surgeon, but what that meant for society as a whole.
What made you decide to start detailing all this and putting it down? And I imagine, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, that it was also therapeutic.
The book came out of a couple of different things. I was actually journaling prior to the shooting happening. That January that year, I wanted to do something different. Started to journal, which was key when the shooting happened, because afterwards I felt completely alone. I was putting down my thoughts, so that was there. And as far as therapeutic, I actually was in therapy, and my therapist asked me to write a trauma narrative about this incident, which I was really trying to avoid revisiting. But I wrote that trauma narrative, and those two sort of merged into becoming this book. So it wasn't meant to be therapeutic, but it arose out of therapy, and I'm trying to make it much bigger. How do we address these big issues that we're grappling with: racism, gun violence, police brutality, systemic inequality? And that's when this all came together to what we have now.
Can you take our listeners, if you can, Dr. Williams, through just the environment when there's a mass shooting and patients are coming into the emergency room? And listen, we see stuff on TV, yeah, whatever, but listen, you're there, along with your colleagues and other staff on the front lines. If you can, just take our listeners through what that's like.
Absolutely. And I just want to start with the common definition of mass shootings. They're the ones that make the news, like the one that happened last night. But by definition, any mass shooting is 4 or more victims, and they're happening all of the time across this country away from the cameras. But our trauma teams, we train for these. We drill for mass shootings. So when they occur, we fall back on our training and do what we're supposed to do to deal with an influx of multiple victims. Some are critical, some are not. And people they know their roles. But things are much different when you have something like an AR-15. Like the bodily injuries from those are truly devastating. And I tell people, if you can imagine what it'd be like to lie on a grenade, that is the sort of damage you will get from an AR-15. These wounds are beyond the skills of the best trauma surgeon to repair.
What's the youngest victim you've had to work on, Doctor?
Infants, maybe less than a year old, not even old enough to walk. So I've cared for victims of all ages, young and old, economic backgrounds, ethnicities and races, but the majority of my victims have been young Black men because I've chosen to work in health systems that are generally located next to racially segregated communities. That was my choice to be there.
There's something else in the book because you take the reader through, I guess what we call a critical look at the way racism impacts the care different folks receive. And you talk about how some hospitals can victimize people who use hospitals as a safety net, but also there's a lot in here because depending on, in some areas, we're not saying this is as a blanket generalization, who is coming into the emergency room. Sometimes there's a perception there, basically, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I really want to take a critical look at the healthcare system and how we deliver healthcare in this country. And my career has been at safety net hospitals. These are the hospitals that are expected to catch folks that do not have access to care, can't afford to see a doctor or get their medications. And the result is that when they come to the hospital, generally through the emergency room, their diseases are much further along in a progression because they didn't get the preventative care that you and I probably enjoy. And so the point I was making is, are safety net hospitals, are they part of the solution or part of the problem, right? Because the reason we have this healthcare system, the safety net system, is because we do not invest enough in the health of our nation, right? We invest a lot in health care, which relies on diseased and injured people. But what if we kept people healthy and kept them out of the hospital? What would that mean for the health of the nation?
When it comes to training future physicians, doctors, surgeons, what have you, anyone in the healthcare and health and wellness space, but let's talk about surgeons for a moment. When it comes to training those future doctors, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, should there be a greater emphasis on having some type of cultural competency in terms of dealing with certain communities and then the trauma involved there and then all the other optics around that? How do you see that? Does it need to be greater emphasis? Maybe not enough? You've been in that role. What's it like?
Oh, absolutely. There needs to be more emphasis on cultural competency and talking about the history of racism in medicine and in medical education. And this is what I really enjoy about being in academic medicine, is getting to teach and getting to be around smart people all the time. But a lot of this was absent during my training. We didn't talk about the history of racism within healthcare and how academic medicine has exploited Black people for a long time. I think many people know about Tuskegee, and that's the syphilis study. But we should also mention that was run by the Public Health Service, so the federal government did that. But there's others. J. Marion Sims, who operated on enslaved women, did barbaric vaginal operations without anesthesia. There was forced sterilization of young Black women in the South, which was known as the Mississippi appendectomy. whole body radiation of Black and poor people to study the effects of radiation. Like, just go on and on. There's so much more that we need to talk about.
So you have this at Harvard, because I believe you went to Harvard, right?
I went to Harvard for my residency. I did medical school at University of South Florida, and I did my fellowship actually at Grady Hospital through Emory. But I learned a lot of this stuff after the fact, right? But it was not part of the curriculum during that time. But during my progression and seeing what I was seeing every day on the front lines as a practitioner, and you start to see the patterns of who's coming in and who's suffering. And it's like, I can't fix this in the hospital. There is something happening beyond the walls of the hospital that is funneling these patients to where I work. What is happening? Why is that? What's happening, and how do I be part of the solution?
Which leads me to this, because if you were talking about how to transform policy and law, and also at the same time with compassion and care, I think those are your words. You said until that happens, the bodies will keep coming. So in the meantime, you're running for office there in Dallas.
Yes, I launched my congressional campaign for District 32 here in Dallas. If elected, I'd be the first trauma surgeon in Congress. I'd be the first Black doctor who can actually vote in Congress. And I'm doing this because I spent some time on the Hill working as an advisor to Democratic leaders. I had a chance to work on monumental federal legislation, and I saw what's possible with the right leaders working on behalf of the good of the health of the nation.
You mentioned Grady here in Atlanta and in other areas where we've had some trauma centers, hospitals closure. You know what that's about. That's also a part of this. And you talk about trauma deserts as well.
Exactly. We talk, I'm an academic surgeon, so I look at the scholarly part of this as well, so I can look at the research. And some of my colleagues did some research and looked at the closure of trauma centers across the country. And many of them were closed that left racially segregated communities without a trauma center. So areas that had a lot of violence did not have access to the life-saving care that they need. And we can talk a lot about racism and economics of all that, but the bottom line is that we need to do a better job of committing to the health of populations.
Doctor, why did you choose this line of work?
I tell people that I didn't choose trauma surgery. Trauma surgery chose me. When I was a medical student rotating on the trauma surgery service, I was just really enthralled by the work. The people that were on the team I just felt like they were my people, just committed to going all out to save patients that were near death. And there's a humanistic side of this as well. We get to be there for strangers on some of their darkest days, because we don't wake up expect to be in a life-threatening car accident or to be shot. But when that happens, I think we all want to know that who's ever taking care of our loved ones is there for them, but also there for us to give us the comfort and confidence that we will do what we can to send them home safely to continue their lives. So I enjoy the technical aspects. I enjoy being there for strangers, and I enjoy feeling that every day when I go to work, I'm making a difference in the world.
You mentioned to me earlier that it's often replayed in your mind back in July of 2016 and the events of that day. How are you doing overall?
I'm doing much better than I was 7 years ago, certainly. And it's a continuous process of post-traumatic recovery. I'm open about this in my book about the therapy I went through and how I've grown since then. But I also see that as my superpower now, right? Yeah. When you can own that sort of trauma and then take it and turn it into purpose, that's powerful. And it also, I think, creates empathy towards others who are suffering, and that it's okay for us to share our stories of triumph.
And how often do you share that with residents?
I'm pretty open about it now.
Yeah.
I wrote a book about it, so the book is out there for everyone to consume. When I wrote the book, it's deeply personal, a lot of storytelling. I put it all out there for people to see where I'm coming from, but in the end, it's about it's not about me. It's how do we take this experience I've been through, share it with you, and how we together It's a call to action. How do we go out there and make a difference in the world?
But you're replaying all of this every time, not only just when there's not a mass shooting, but listen, we're less than 24 hours away from yet another horrific mass shooting taking place in Maine. And so far at the time of this broadcast, 18 have been killed.
Exactly. And I think that speaks to the collective trauma communities and the nation experiences from these shootings, right? Survivors, families, they're seeing this and they're being impacted, but we're not without hope, right? We are not without power. We want to have communities safe from gun violence. I think most people can say that. Let's continue to do the work to make that happen. And that is one of the reasons I'm running for office, to take my experience as a trauma surgeon, as a veteran, as a survivor, to that body and say, here's what I think we can do to push forward and keep our communities safe from gun violence.
And I'm curious, Dr. Williams, as well, because when there is a horrific event, like a mass shooting in a community, you look at Buffalo, and I don't know what they've done, but should there be some just mandate that, listen, when something like this happens, let's provide therapy, let's make sure folks who want it have access, folks who have been directly affected by it, particularly if it's a community that's under-resourced, that they have access, and you let them know that we have this resource for you, because that's a major factor as well. It's yes, it's definitely tragic, those who are lost, but then those who are left, who are still in that community.
And yes, there's been a lot of research on the lasting psychological trauma of these mass shootings, what they have on the communities, for children that are growing up in these environments where shootings happen all the time. So, and that's one thing that in the gun safety bill that was passed last year, there was money in that to address these issues in communities. But you are right. I think the point there is that there are ripple effects from these shootings that go far beyond the individuals that were injured and killed.
Dr. Brian Williams, a trauma surgeon and the author of the new book, The Bodies Keep Coming, Dispatches from a Black Trauma Surgeon on Racism, Violence, and How We Heal. Thank you so much for taking time. I appreciate it, Dr. Williams. Best of luck to you.
Thank you very much for having me, Rose. Have a great day.
You too.